Mark Urban. Well, a little earlier I spoke to Congressman Adam Schiff, who's on the US House of Representatives Intelligence Committee, and to Danielle Pletka, author of Dissent and Reform in the Arab World and Vice President of the conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. Congressman Schiff, why did you choose to vote against the Obama administration's plan to use the CIA to arm the Syrian rebels?
I have a great deal of concern about getting involved in yet another civil war, and I think that there are better steps that we can take than providing arms that we can't be sure, even if they get in the right hands, will stay in the right hands. I think we should retain our focus on getting the parties to a negotiated settlement, on providing humanitarian relief, on taking action with the international community on the chemical weapons threat and trying to degrade Assad's ability to deliver chemical weapons again. But becoming an arms supplier in a civil war is not something I favor, and that's something I've been speaking out on.
And just so I understand the kind of consensus within the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, I mean, the House Chairman, Mike Rogers, talked of very strong concerns. So even though most people seem to have gone along with the Obama administration, is there a real sense that some people feel he's making a mistake?
I think there's a broad concern within the Congress about getting involved in this sectarian civil war, that a small amount of weapons is unlikely to make a difference, and that we would have to provide such a massive quantity of arms and sophisticated weapons to tilt the balance on the battlefield that inevitably would be drawn further and further into the civil war. And again, there's that fear I think most members of Congress have on both sides of the aisle, that even if you can vet members of the opposition that you provide weapons to, you can't be sure that they will stay with that vetted opposition. Many of the rebel groups are now fighting each other, and we have to prudently expect that some percentage of whatever weapons we might supply would get into the wrong hands.
Right.
So without getting into any specifics about what the administration is asking for or calling for, I do want to express my general concern with our becoming any kind of a weapons supplier.
Let me bring in Danielle Pletka on that. You've heard those reservations, but also General Martin Dempsey, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs, is warning of unintended consequences and deeper involvement will be hard to avoid. You must be very uncomfortable that a senior general with real experience of Iraq is so unenthusiastic about all this.
No, I'm not surprised at what General Dempsey is saying. The military is always unenthusiastic about war, and that's why we have a civilian commander-in-chief who leads them. The president has made a decision about arming the rebels in Syria, but I think the congressman raises some very reasonable caveats. You know, the honest truth is that if this were a conflict that were confined only to Syria, if we could somehow hermetically seal it off, then perhaps the American Congress could sit by and watch as hundreds of thousands of people are killed without fear that there would be an expansion regionally. As for the question of arms getting into the wrong hands, I'm afraid that horse has already left the stable. Arms are already in the wrong hands. That's one of the reasons why the balance has tilted, as the chairman said last week, in favor of Assad.
Congressman, I wondered how you're going to judge, as you monitor the CIA's arming of these rebels, how it's working, because presumably you will rely on the intelligence coming from the CIA on a policy which they're expecting to implement, and they may not be entirely straight in telling you whether it's working.
Well, you know, of course it's going to be very difficult to monitor exactly how the provision of any material support is helping the opposition, but that's part of our responsibility to oversee anything that might be undertaken. You know, I will say this in response to the comments that were made. You know, it is very seductive to want to help the opposition here, to want to get involved and balance out what Hezbollah or the Russians are doing. That's why it's so easy to get involved in conflicts. Unfortunately, we find that as easy it is to get in, it's very difficult to get out, to extricate yourself from a civil war. And I fear that we will simply be drawn further and further into this conflict. You know, there's a question that we have the capability of doing this. We have the capability of deciding the course of this conflict in the sense of who wins militarily and who does not. But as we see in Afghanistan, as we saw in Iraq, the military equation is only one part of the equation. And as General Dempsey pointed out so forcefully the other day, even when you do change the trajectory on the battlefield, that's not the end of the story. If it was, the war in Afghanistan would have been over a long time ago. You also have to be concerned about what comes in after.
Let me bring in Danielle Pletka on that, because that is the core of what General Dempsey is saying, and I'm just wondering whether your judgment is, whatever the policy appears to be now, in another year's time, the United States will be more deeply involved in Syria.
No, I don't know that we will be more deeply involved. I'm waiting for the president to actually implement the arms transfers that he suggested were going to happen. It's funny, the congressman suggests that it's easy to be seduced by ideas of helping people. Well, I do find ideas of helping people rather seductive, but I think that the notion of getting in between Assad and Hezbollah and then Al-Qaeda is not a terribly attractive one. On the other hand, I think that anyone who is, as the congressman is, an ardent and correct supporter of Israel and the relationship between the United States and Israel needs to understand that the Syrian conflict is not staying in Syria. It's already spilled over to Iraq. It's spilling over to Lebanon. It's spilling into Turkey and Jordan. And Hezbollah is gaining a foothold on the hills in the Golan, which will open a second front toward Israel. The notion that this isn't going to drag in other parties where we do have great interests is, I'm afraid, a bit of a pipe dream.
Well, a final thought from Congressman Schiff, if I may then. Do you, in your judgment, in your judgment, do you think the United States will be more deeply involved in a year's time in Syria?
Yes, I do. I mean, if we take this step now of getting more militarily involved, we will inevitably be called upon to do more for all the reasons Danielle mentions, which is once we make this a proxy war with Russia and Hezbollah, once we put the credibility of the United States on the line to that degree, then the arguments become irresistible that, well, we've got to do more. If the battle isn't still going well, then we've got to do more. We've got to provide more weapons, more sophisticated weapons. That's how you end up escalating. That's how you have mission creep. That's how you get sucked in. And after two wars, after drawing down from one, now drawing down from another, there is simply little appetite to get involved in yet a third civil war in a Muslim country.
Okay. Representative Schiff, Danielle Pletka, thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, the first public glimpse of the new Royal